Hello and welcome to this Noble Science of Defence training video. In this video we're going to have a quick look at the parries that we use in the training. Parries we use differently to wards. A parry is used to actively defend against an incoming strike. If you have allowed your opponent to make a strike against you, it means that you have lost control and your opponent has control. In this situation, the only thing you should concentrate on is defending the incoming attack. So I've brought George with me today. He's going to help out with the attacks and we're going to demonstrate how the parries work. So to start with, I stand in my guard and in my fighting stance with my left foot forwards. My guard sits directly on my centre line. When I make the parry, my hilt will move across to my nipple line. That's halfway between my shoulder and my centre. And my tip will roll offline, the pivot, the middle of my blade, sitting on my shoulder line. So from this position, you see the front half of my sword is away, out of my shoulder line. The rear half of my sword, the strong or the shield, is sat covering my body. Generally, when we make a parry, I would also step away from the incoming attack, and now you can see my entire body is out of the way of the incoming attack. So the idea when I parry is that my opponent has not only been allowed to make an attack at me, but they've seen an opening. When I hold my guard on the centre such as this, the opening is equal on either side. So my opponent may choose to strike on either side. You'll see if they choose to strike to the inside and I have to move my parry, you see where this is clear and available for my opponent to strike. As I move my sword in the way, I have now blocked the route to this position. When I then step, I also move my body completely clear, thus completely defeating the opponent's strike. I cover the quarter to which they are striking, I step and I move everything completely out of line. On the outside, I cover the outside quarter and I step, removing it completely. So we'll just do a quick demonstration of that first. If George were to launch an attack to my inside, I step and I make my parry. George were to attack to the outside, the same. So the mechanics of this parry are that I do not want to catch my opponent's blade on the edge of my sword. If my opponent makes the cut in and I put the edge of my sword against the edge of theirs, I'm going directly against the strength of my opponent's incoming attack, which is fine, presuming that I am stronger than my opponent and presuming that my sword, in fact, is not going to just break. In this instance, our swords will bite because they are sharp, which puts a weakness in my blade that puts it at risk for breaking the next time that I make a parry. Also, I have to push against the strength of my opponent. Now, if this is a long sword or a bill, for example, I can't stand and just hold that with my arm. It's not going to work. So when I parry, I want to catch along the back edge of the blade. So I turn my blade over and lay it out. What happens here, if you come in nice and slowly for me, I catch the blade on the outside, on the back edge of the blade. And as my opponent presses in with his sword, he just slides down. So what I'm doing is using the angle to redirect my opponent's strike. So if George were to strike me quite hard, you'll see it just slides down. So if George were to make quite a heavy cut at my head, and again, and really try, you see that quite easily I can redirect the force of his attack. He just slides down my weapon. Again, when we have steel swords, I also have flex strike this time. So if George makes a heavy strike across to my head in a horizontal strike, yeah. But as George's sword hits mine, the sword flexes, and this again takes out some of the impact, some of the energy that he's putting into his cut. For stepping, I step wherever is comfortable. George Silver recommends in his general rules that I move my rear foot circularly from the direction where I am being cut. So in this instance, if George is cutting to my inside, I move my rear foot to my outside. George cuts to my outside, I move my rear foot across to the inside. George Silver gives us a general rule. My rule is move wherever is comfortable. All I have to do to defeat the strength of this attack is to move away from where I was when the attack was launched. So when my opponent makes a cut, they're cutting to where I am at the point that they launch the attack. So if I take a small step to the side, I am now not where the cut was aimed, and therefore this now has less strength at this point. He's got to extend this further to be able to reach me. Potentially, the cut comes in, and I can step this way. It seems dangerous, it's bringing me closer to this, but that means this now has less energy because I'm getting to it before it comes into its full force. I can step straight backwards, and thus out of the way of the strike. I can slip backwards, and thus out of the way of most of the strike. I can gather backwards, and out of the way of the strike. So to move my rear foot circularly is a way that I can hold my ground and make a parry, thus giving me a good opportunity to make my counter strike. However, as beginners, I would much rather that you chose to run away from the strike. Not being there is much safer. My opponent makes a strike at me, much safer. This also allows me to work into the 4 actions and times, as well as the 4 offensive actions. So my opponent makes a strike, I can slip back, and I can choose to make a cut on the other side. So as I mentioned earlier, when you have allowed your opponent to make a strike against you, they have taken control of the situation. Now, later on, you will learn how to make your opponent make a strike against you. And in that scenario, I can, in the knowledge of the attack my opponent is making, I can stand my ground, I can control, I can counter strike from that position, I can make a counter cut as the cut comes in. There are a lot of options. However, in the beginning, your opponent has made an attack, they have taken control. That means that you don't have control. Making this parry will not bring control back to you. This will only prevent you from being struck and remove the control from your opponent, making it neutral. So once you have made your parry, as we see George Silver mention quite a lot, you should fly out instantly. This is always going to be the safest way. It means I can reset to my first distance and I can begin to regain my control. So on every single parry you ever make, ever, your opponent cuts in, parry, step away. My opponent moves to the outside, parry, step away. I can make this safer. You see my opponent's blade is still there. My opponent cuts in, I parry, I can now clear his weapon and step away. To the outside, I parry, clear the weapon and step away. There is a third option here where I can prevent my opponent from chasing me as he may have want to do. My opponent strikes, I parry, I clear his weapon and strike as I step away. Again on the outside, parry, clear and strike as I step away. If I make the strike, it is not to make an attempt to strike my opponent. It is entirely to prevent my opponent from walking into me. He's going to have to consider that there is a blade coming past. So that's the first look at the parries that we use in our system. I start with a guard. My hilt moves halfway between my center and my shoulder line. My pivot point, halfway up my blade, moves to my shoulder line. The weak of my blade moves out of my shoulder. I'm not using that at the moment. The strong of my blade stays covering my body. I also make a step away from the direction of the incoming attack. So inside parry and step to the outside, outside parry and step to the inside. So hopefully that's been useful for you and we look forward to seeing you using it in class. Thank you very much.